representation and stability were actually two different critiques. But one of the things that you said when you were talking about stability, that in an election, you might have changes in government, but at the end, you're likely to have in a PR system a lot of the same people around the sort of the cabinet table. And that's something I think about PR systems that concerns me, probably should concern people who are skeptical about a lot of the things that government do. I think one of the great advantages, I know that there are many, but of democracies is that you can throw the bums out, you can get rid of the government. And that seems like one of the difficulties in a PR system is you need very large shifts in the electorate, which seem not to happen very frequently. In the sort of system we have now, it's much easier to get rid of a government. So I wonder if you could comment on that and whether you see that as accurate and as a positive or negative thing.
Sure. Well, thank you for that. And the prime example is Italy. Since the Second World War, on average, they have a new government every 18 months, I think. And so social scientists used to be very concerned about it and said, great instability, do we want to be like Italy? Right? And then later on, I would say the last 15 years or so, the story has shifted completely. Now social scientists say, the problem with Italy is they have too much stability, right? Because there's always 80–90% of the same people around the cabinet. And that leads to corruption, cronyism, and all of those problems. So yes, there are extremes to be avoided. I don't, I have argued for strenuously from the time I wrote my book. I studied this in the early 1990s extensively. And I've always been impressed with the single transferable vote, which is a form of proportional representation. It is not extreme proportional representation. That is, it still over-rewards a little bit the larger parties. And so that, but secondly, what I said earlier, it puts the voters in the driver's seat. And that is the part that I really like as a Democrat. We can all argue and have different points of view about what a political agenda should look like and what public policies are healthy and good and beneficial and so on. But I think at bottom, most of us, regardless of our other differences, would agree that in a democracy you want full citizens' participation. And because in an election system you allocate and portion out power, and you put in place accountability measures, it is centrally important, to my way of thinking, that our voters be in the driver's seat when it comes to making those kind of choices. So it's a long answer.
Well, thank you very much. I'm from the U.S., and of course we have the same system. And for best opposed plurality, except that I think our congressional districts are something like 7 times larger than the Canadian. You call them ridings or something like that?
Yeah, we do.
So the sense of that you really don't have a voice, that as an ordinary citizen you're hardly represented, really not represented at all, is even stronger. I also think the U.S. has 2 major parties, and that is a direct result of first past the post voting systems. I was, a long time ago, it was like 15 years ago now, I was involved in the Libertarian Party, and I was actually, for a time, I was national vice chair. And during that time, I was all full of enthusiasm for the ideas that we could promote, that we could advance. But then I studied the history of third parties in America, and it became very obvious that a third party essentially had no serious chance of power. That the only avenue was through education and trying to get your voice heard through one of the major parties. So, there's been a lot of advocacy for proportional representation in the U.S., but it just doesn't get traction. I think a central problem, I don't know if you have an answer to this or not, is that it's unfamiliar, that people just don't know what it would mean, what it would expect. And are there, what can you point to? How can you show people what it would be? That's my question.
Right. It's unfamiliar, and we don't like the unfamiliar, right? And that's certainly part of the problem. The U.S. system is quite different. Although we share the same voting system, we have a very different allocation of powers. The U.S. system is much more balanced between the executive and the legislative. In our system, a party and a leader that has a majority of the seats has virtually unlimited power. We don't have the checks and balances that your system does. In terms of, it used to be the case that U.S. Congress people would have greater amount of freedom from party discipline and could therefore, and because of the primary, particularly in the open primaries, could speak for voters and would want to speak for voters. There's less of that because of all the gerrymandering. There are fewer districts that could go either way. And when districts are solidly Democrat or solidly Republican, in some way it curtails freedom of speech. Because, the poor congressperson who wants to get reelected must stick to the party line. There's no longer freedom, right? That's sad. Anyway, the comparisons between our countries are very difficult to make. And there have been attempts, successful attempts, at introducing choice voting, which is at the local levels, some of the cities. And some people here will be happy with that if we get that, in the belief that that is a first step to better things to come. I don't believe that for a minute. Australia's had choice voting, a preferential ballot, also known as the alternative vote, since 1901, as I mentioned. They've never been able to break away from it. We have in Canada, in our history, we've experimented provincially in 52, 53 elections. We had the preferential ballot. We've seen it in Alberta for almost 20 years, in Manitoba. In every instance where we at one time had it, it was taken away, and we didn't progress. We went back. We went back to first past the post, and it was always the political leadership that pulled that off. They never consulted with the voters. Very important to know that history, right? So when Andrew Coyne writes that we should be happy to get preferential ballot because it's the first small step on the way to glorious things, I don't believe it for 1 minute. Not for a minute. Because as long as those in power have any say, we will not progress. We'll go back. Thanks.
Yeah, anyway, Nick, that was an interesting talk, but it's, you're basically just talking about tinkering with democracy. And this is a conference on liberty. And I think you're kind of operating under the assumption that democracy is this wonderful concept that we all agree is so great. But I'm going to reject that concept and say that you can have a democracy or you can have liberty, but you can't have both. And democracy at its very, very best is nothing more than mob rule. So it's basically illegitimate. There's no, and the reason it's illegitimate is because you're forced into it. You can't opt out. There's no mean mechanism for you to opt out, and therefore it's illegitimate because it's imposed on you. And as a result, in democracies, we've had such egregious things as in the States, they had slavery, blacks weren't allowed to marry whites, Hitler was democratically elected. In Canada, we had the First Nations people, they were denied the right to vote, they were rounded up, sent in little reservations, and there was residential schools, the Japanese internment camps, all their property was seized. These are all consistent with democracy. They're not consistent with liberty. And there's so many lists. Like, democracy routinely tramples on individual rights. We have prohibition of alcohol. Jody's going to talk about marijuana. If, you know, even in most democracy, you don't even get majority rule. In most cases, you get ruled by a minority. So even if you have a majority that wants a certain policy, you don't get it. But the reason it's illegitimate is you've got to have voluntary consent. That's what I think.
Well, thank you for that, and it's a view I do not share. You know, that's all I can say. I still, my faith is in the common sense of the common people. And I believe that those who pay the taxes, those who are affected by decisions, should have maximum participation in making those decisions. And I believe that overall, the common folk will make fewer mistakes than if we allow an elite to make the decisions for them. But, you know, I respectfully disagree. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for your efforts in our continuing education process. Also from the United States, we notice in our country that politicians are often pocketized and purchased by large corporations. Those corporations instruct these people as to what to say in order to become elected, and then the reality, boots on the ground reality, turns out to be something quite different. What's our move?
Pardon me, sorry, what was your question right at the end?
What's our move? How do we circumvent this process of politicians who vote for the people who put them in office?
Well, you know, that's a difficult one. See, I believe that there should be very stringent disclosure and limits on spending. But I'm sure there are people in this room that violently disagree with that. Half the people here would disagree.
No, disclosure's fine. Right?
Okay, but yeah, my own view is that money corrupts, and you have to have to create level playing fields and to have liberty for all and not just for the well-to-do. There have to be some limits put on what you allow people to do. I hate to say that, but some of you are going to. But that's my view. You know, I love Swiss society, right? And the Swiss have a culture where you involve people meaningfully. And they have a wonderful way of, I mean, people even approved in referenda tax increases, right? It's almost unimaginable. Where people said, no, okay, you convince me. If you make good use of the money, we'll approve a tax increase, right? But there is absolutely no advertising allowed, period, right? And if there is any kind of public promotion, it has to be apportioned equally to all sides of the referendum debate and so on. So, yeah, I love that. Maybe it's too idealistic. But that's, you know, I don't know if it answers your question. I think what's happening in the U.S. is an undermining of liberty. I don't believe that that is liberty. It is allowing some people with deep pockets to, in fact, hijack the whole democratic process. And I just cannot fathom how a Supreme Court can open the floodgates and say, oh yeah, we'll just allow all of this to happen. To me, that, you know, it's allowing somebody with a sledgehammer to run amok out here in the courtyard. I find it offensive. But that's the first one.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for speaking today. So I lost an election in high school because of we didn't use first past the post, so I'm still bitter. But my question is, as common citizens in Canada, if we do want to move, excuse me, if we do want to move towards proportional representation, but we can't actually do anything to change it, is there a legal process in which we can participate and actually put forth our opinion in a way that will, force politicians to actually do something about it, other than, just what they're doing now to placate, people's opinions?
Well, I thank you for the question. Maybe the Canadian Constitution people can help. There have been some attempts to, on the basis of the Charter and so on, to try and force this equality and so on. I mean, talk about equality. In the last election, this 2 weeks ago, right? Every 37,000 Liberal voters got one seat. How many Green voters did it take to get one seat? Over 600,000, right? Look at the Conservatives. It took 56,000. Every 56,000 Conservative votes got one seat. How about the NDP? 78,000. So an NDP vote, you needed 3 NDP votes to get the same clout in Ottawa as every one Liberal vote. That's a question of inequality. I mean, it's a question of gross unfairness between the value of your votes. So yes, there have been attempts to invoke the Charter, but the courts want none of it. They say, oh no, this is something for the political people to resolve. And so far the court challenges have not been successful. I've been at this, for 20 years I was very active, an activist for this. We have to keep this up. As long as there's injustice, we have to stand up for what is right. And you do it in a multitude of ways. So there's Fair Vote Canada, there's Fair Vote in BC. And certainly, the promise of Trudeau ought to be fastened onto, and we need to just keep talking about this. Short of civil disobedience, being hauled off to jail, we might have to do that. One last question, I think. That's probably it.
Okay, great. Thanks for presenting. I would say I'm sympathetic to proportional representation in general, but there is always one thing that I've always thought that first past the post or majoritarian system has that PR will potentially lose, and it's the fact that in first past the post you get to, sounds kind of bad, but you get to disenfranchise certain people who are very unpopular. So, for example, PR systems, as you can see a little bit happening slowly in Scandinavian countries and in Northern European countries, since they're so democratic, they allow, for example, racist parties or fascist parties or hardcore communist parties to have a say. You have a little bit of that in Israel as well, where these more extremist parties, because they can get 10% of the vote, because 10% of the people are pretty extreme in one way or another, they can show up. They're suddenly in the government. They have a say in tax policy, immigration policy, or social policy. Isn't that sort of a benefit of first past the post that these kind of weirdos and Nazis and communists are kind of shut out because it's super difficult for them to win in one riding, whereas they could have a large 500,000 votes spread across America, but they can't get 500,000 votes in one riding. I don't know, it's a point against democracy is what I'm saying, but it's good because it keeps out dangerous people. I don't know if you think that's a fair point or not. I would be interested in your idea on that.
Well, my response is, look, we have to allow some extremists or views that are not shared by the majority. And that's a delightful aspect of democracy. It means tolerance. And we have to not, you know, try to rig the system so that we keep certain people out because we don't approve of it. I'm totally against that. It just violates any notion of democracy. What I like, and I said it earlier, what I like about the single transport vote is that it's a form of proportional representation. It yields proportional results, but it puts the voters in the driver's seat. So if voters get fed up with an extremist party or views that are not acceptable, the voters will bring down the hammer on those. But you know, if they attract voters, we have to respect them. Okay, we cannot say, well, we only like this system if it delivers seats for me and my friends. Just, you know, you're either a Democrat or you're not. You either believe in people, you either believe in liberty or not. I remember being on Rafe Mayor's program. And Rafe at one time, earlier in his career, I mean, most of you don't remember Rafe Mayor. I guess I'm getting old, but he was fairly right wing at one time, and he interviewed me on my book in 1997, many times in fact. And so he says, you know, we might elect a left-wing government if we go for this. And he says to me, well, surely you and I would not approve of that. And I said, Rafe, if it's the choice of the people that there be a left-wing government, you and I ought to recognize that it's the choice of the people and welcome that for that reason. And that's how I feel. Thank you very much.